It's October 31st, Halloween. That means it's time for a new horror edition of 31 on 31. And this is a special year. We're looking at the big three of slasher franchises. But there aren't 31 movies in these franchises anymore. There's now 33 movies. So today we're going to stop and rank all 33 Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street films from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies and TV way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. If you're up for the challenge, share your ranking of all 33 movies included in this ranking. My list is definitely not the right list, but it is my list, and I would love to see yours. As we go into this, 31 on 31 is a series of the Autopstream. I'm participating in this with Cody Leach, Brian Lomax, and CP. Once you've watched my video, be sure to head over to their channels and watch their 31 on 31 videos as well. I'll have links down below in the description as well as in a pinned comment. For this set of films, I decided I just wanted to do a deep dive into every single one of the franchises. So I bought the Crystal Lake Memories documentary, bought the Never Sleep Again documentary, re-listened to Taking Shape, the Halloween behind the scenes audio book, watched all the special features, checked out a ton of YouTube videos on the making of a bunch of these movies. Down below in the description, I will have links to all the stuff I checked out if you're interested in doing your own deep dive into these franchises. Like with the Taking Shape audiobook, you can get it for free if you sign up for a free trial of Audible at audibletrials.com/Sean Chandler. Link is down below in the description. And let's get started. In last place, Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare, a shockingly lame addition to the franchise that just proved they'd run out of good ideas and they just wanted to keep making sequels for the sake of making sequels. And in the case of this film, it just felt like they doubled down on all the worst aspects of the previous two films in the franchise, and they just didn't have anywhere to go with it. And since they had killed Freddy off in previous Nightmare on Elm Street films, even the movie's central premise, hook, and title hold no weight because you know they can just find some cheap excuse to bring him back. But really what just absolutely kills this movie is that it is goofy beyond all belief from beginning to end.
Intentionally made a decision, to kind of do a Warner Brothers cartoon.
In the opening sequence, there's a parody of The Wizard of Oz. There's people being killed by Q-tips. And so much of the movie plays like Looney Tunes humor rather than a horror film. And even in the special features, they acknowledged that they were like, yeah, we tried to do scary, so we thought, let's just lean into the silly side of things. In which case, you just get this R-rated cartoon that I don't know who it's really for.
It does have a great sight gag, though, when Freddy drags out the big cart of spikes.
The image in my mind was like Bugs Bunny doing it in some old Bugs Bunny cartoon that I love.
And there's a whole sequence where Freddy Krueger is playing Breckin Myers as a video game character, and anything that was terrifying about Freddy at one point in time gets totally lost when he's just a clown playing video games. And so it's a movie that sacrificed all credibility, completely lost its way. It has a central premise that doesn't make a lot of sense about a city with absolutely no kids in it. Then when you move into the third act, it tries to do a 3D gimmick. The director on the special features admitted that she didn't want to do 3D. She thought it actually sacrificed doing visually interesting things for the sake of a gimmick.
To me, what could have been really cool in killing Freddy would have been if you could have made this really fantastic effect sequence. But I was completely limited in shooting in 3D.
So in the end, this movie's kind of a nightmare in all the wrong ways. Number 32, Halloween Resurrection, a terrible idea for a Halloween film that leads to one of the worst possible endings for Laurie Strode's arc.
As a matter of fact, it was.
This movie is one of the worst examples of a producer caring more about making money by producing sequels than caring about the story or the character's legacy, because it's well documented that almost everyone that made H2O wanted that movie to have a definitive ending where Laurie Strode killed Michael Myers, but the producer wanted to make more movies, and thus the beginning of this film undoes the ending of the previous film and has Michael Myers kill Laurie Strode where she gets duped, falls into a trap, and gets herself killed. I mean, it's just a shockingly bad way to undo the victory of the previous film and kill off a great character in a stupid way. All so that we can have an even lamer Halloween movie, where now it's this just schlocky premise about a reality TV show about people in Michael Myers' house, and it turns out Michael Myers is actually there killing people, which isn't the worst idea for a cheap horror film, but as a Halloween movie, doesn't match the atmosphere, the tone, the vibe. And I don't care about any of these characters, and you killed off the one character I did care about in the opening sequence. And so it's just a movie that's just a terrible meshing of a franchise with a premise. They don't go together. And the worst of all of it is that they killed off Laurie Strode and undid her defeating of Michael Myers so that Busta Rhymes could use karate he learned from martial arts movies to beat up Michael Myers. And then ultimately defeats Michael Myers by electrocuting his balls.
Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!
How is this a real thing? Number 31, A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child. And to be perfectly honest, I don't really enjoy these later era Nightmare on Elm Street sequels. I just find them pretty unpleasant.
We made to the fans that we were not going to make a movie that we didn't think was going to be good. 5 was arguably lame.
There's a few ideas in here that are interesting, like the idea of Freddy getting into the dreams of an unborn child. Well, that's kind of interesting. And there's always a few just freaky, weird images in the Nightmare on Elm Street films, especially like the motorcycle kill and everything. Gets pretty wild and crazy. But this whole movie just feels like diminishing returns. One of the big problems here is that because we've already defeated Freddy in every previous film and we've killed him off in every previous film, and there's always some excuse as to why he can come back, it just feels like there's no rules. None of it really matters. We keep coming up with a new way you defeat him and a new way to bring him back. And so no victory feels earned. No victory feels like it matters because it can just be undone. And from there, it's just a really unpleasant setup about like a girl getting pregnant in the beginning and Freddy's taking over the baby.
It's a boy!
It's like, okay, I mean, I guess you got to do something new and find some way to rebirth him into this world. And yeah, it leads to like these freaky images of this deformed baby Freddy monster being born. But at the same time, it just feels gimmicky and cheap, and it just doesn't feel earned. Like, right, babies that are monsters and birthing, like, yeah, it's horrifying stuff in a sense, but it doesn't feel earned. It feels like we're just finding excuses to keep on going. And so it's just a movie that I didn't enjoy. Kicking off the top 30 is Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. And I can respect that Rob Zombie is an auteur director with a very distinct vision for his films. When you watch a Rob Zombie Halloween movie, it feels like it was created by a singular force. It doesn't feel like it was created or written by committee. So I can respect that he was trying to do something distinct, and so I can understand why some people love Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. I am not one of those people, and I just feel like I don't understand why Zombie has to make every character in his movies so unbelievably crass and unpleasant.
No, don't like that.
I mean, in the opening of this movie, you have two ambulance drivers talking about being turned on by the naked body of a girl that was just knifed to death. And then they start like contemplating, would they ever experiment with a little bit of necrophilia? And maybe this girl would be the one to like push them over the edge to do that. Ew. Like, that's just a random conversation between two people in the movie. Like, of all the things to have people talking about, that is where you go? Pedophile, necrophile, rapists? Really, Mr. Zombie? What are we doing here? And then from there, you kind of go into the actual main characters, and he's trying to do this Requiem for a Dream. Everyone has PTSD. How does everyone respond to what happened in the previous film? And so Laurie Strode is just 100% of the movie in meltdown mode. There's no baseline. It's just always meltdown mode. And Loomis has just turned into this prima donna that doesn't feel like a natural next step to where he was before. He's just an unbelievable douchebag. So you put that all together, and the movie itself is just unpleasant. And I don't get anything out of it. I'm not sure that a slasher film is the right mechanism to do a character study about PTSD. And that's what this movie seems to think that it is. And so you get 2 hours of watching deeply broken people make bad choices and then be brutally murdered. Next up, A Nightmare on Elm Street for the Dream Master. And as I mentioned before, the post-Dream Warriors Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, I just didn't really care for them for a number of different reasons. Now, to the movie's credit, they brought in Rennie Harlin, who had a great eye. So this movie just has this big cinematic slickness to it in the look. Just immediately, I think it looks flashier. The movie does build to a nice finale with the girl gaining a bunch of powers. And I always appreciate getting to see the 80s practical effects.
How sweet, fresh meat.
But on a story level, coming after Dream Warriors, this movie just was such a letdown and felt like there was just a lack of ideas.
Some of the later films, we were stretching perhaps a little more than we ought to have to create a sequel because we really wanted to have a sequel.
It commits, to me, one of the ultimate cinematic sins, which is undoing the victory of the previous film. Something we've already talked about in this video, where the first half of this movie is we're killing off all the Dream Warriors. All the people that defeated Freddy in the last film, we're killing them off. And thus in doing so, we're undoing even Nancy's sacrifice that was able to stop Freddy, but he's just coming back anyway. And how is he able to come back? A dog pisses flames on Freddy's grave. There it is. Freddy's coming back. And so it just feels like desperately looking for any excuse to continue the franchise so that we can keep making money, even if it means undermining our own films, our own victories. And I just hate that stuff. And so some of it's just the aesthetics of these movies, the vibe of them. I just don't find them as rewatchable or watchable in general as like the Halloween and Friday the 13th crappy. The crappy ones in those franchises are more fun to me than the crappy ones in this franchise. So they're pretty low. Number 28, Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning. A desperate and baffling attempt to continue this franchise. I mean, Part 2 retconned the continuity so that Jason was alive and could be the killer. Now we're just continuing onwards without even Jason being the killer. People are just pretending to be him. And it just feels like just a shameless movie that's doing anything it can to continue making sequels and cranking out movies because they're cheap to make and they always make a profit. And so you just get this movie where the inciting incident involves a murder over a candy bar leading to people being killed at this place.
What a story, Mark.
And then it has this laughably goofy Scooby-Doo ending where you're like, wait a minute, who is the killer? Why were they going to kill her? Really? That was the motivation? That's the actual plot of this movie? That's where all of this was heading? Add to that, you just have this kind of wacky, over-the-top performance from Tommy that once again doesn't feel like a natural continuation of the character in Part 4. So, there's some goofy fun here and there. I find the Friday the 13th movies just easy movies to digest because they're so simple and straightforward. But on a story level, it's a bad idea for a movie with an even goofier script. But I do know it has its fans. Actually, I was talking with my neighbor, and he said this one was one of his favorites of the franchise. Definitely not one of my favorites. Speaking of bad ideas for sequels, number 27, Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers. And this just feels like a movie where they wrote themselves into a corner and had to desperately come up with some way to get out of that corner. So all of a sudden, they take this franchise built on a very simple premise, and now Michael is the fulfillment of a prophecy, and there's a cult dedicated to him, and Jamie's been kidnapped for years, and they've been holding her hostage and raping her so she can have a child to continue on the curse. I don't know what they're doing, but it was a lot of bad ideas, And then a movie with a very troubled production where the script was constantly changing. They were messing with it during production. They reworked the movie after a bad test screening. And so it feels like there's no actual definitive version of this film. There's just all these different people working together, trying to cobble something together. And we ended up with two very faulty versions of it. The producer's cut is more coherent, but it literally introduces the plot point that now Michael Myers is Jamie's pedophile, incestual rapist of Jamie and the baby daddy. Like, no, there's no reason to do that.
This is a mess. None of these storylines make any sense.
And then you have the theatrical cut, which is nonsense. It's got more action in the third cut, but at least, you know, we're not doing super creepy stuff with Michael Myers. So just a movie where they got in a corner and they just desperately tried to get out of it with goofy ideas, and it really, really, really didn't work at all. But we do get to see sexiest man alive, Paul Rudd, in his film debut. Then we have Jason Goes to Hell, an absolutely insane sequel. 9 movies into this franchise, they just throw out all the rules, build an entirely new mythology where Jason's soul can hop bodies, and this starts with someone eating his heart, and he needs to get into the body of a Voorhees to become stable.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
And Jason has a sister and now a niece, and he can only be killed by a special magic dagger, and there's an actual Necronomicon in the Voorhees house.
Groovy.
And when Jason, in other people's bodies, looks at a mirror, it reflects Jason in a hockey mask.
Wow. That was weird.
So after watching the movie, I watched all the special features and the segment in Crystal Lake Memories, and there's a ton of stuff from the director who is just has a very infectious energy. He's very passionate about his ideas, and he had a reason for every single thing that he did in this movie, and it spawned from his love for Evil Dead, which is very obvious once you watch this movie, and he believes that Jason is a deadite brought back by the Necronomicon, which makes a lot of sense when you watch what he's trying to do. And he was so passionate about all of this, he almost convinced me that the movie made sense in light of the continuity and everything like that. And then I remembered the movie itself and the rest of the franchise. I was like, no. It's wild, it's wacky, but there's a certain energy and fun to it at the same time, in particular when you realize what the director was trying to do. And there's just choices that I just don't think were very good. Like, there's this whole interesting bounty hunter character that seems like he's going to be more relevant than he actually is, but he just keeps disappearing and he's underutilized. There's just a lot of things like that where you go like, that's a neat idea. That's an interesting idea. And then they don't fully follow through on them. And so as interesting as it is to have this wacky, insane movie that tries to bring in Sam Raimi's Evil Dead lore into the Friday the 13th franchise to make sense of Jason Voorhees coming back to life multiple times, I don't know that the movie actually works overall. Number 25, Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood. And this is one of the Friday the 13th movies I watched the most growing up, or at least segments of it, when it would show up on TNT, TBS late at night. It was this one and Part 6 were the two that I seemed to catch the most. So I have a certain nostalgia for this film. And so I always frequently put it on thinking I'm going to enjoy it more, but the characters here are just so unpleasant. So many of them are just so grating and in your face. It makes for a difficult film to watch, though it does have a fun finale. They openly have admitted they were trying to do a ripoff of Carrie, so you could have a nice showdown at the end between Jason Voorhees and Carrie. And so when you get to the showdown, it's actually kind of fun to have a boss fight between the two of them, duking it out, his raw power, her power she's slowly learning to control. It's different, it adds something, and it's a fun sequence. Problem, however, though, is the ride to get there, which the character of Carrie was a deeply troubled person in the movie Carrie, but that movie was designed to be about a troubled girl, about her home life and how people treat her at school and how this has dire consequences. It is built around her having meltdowns all the time because of everything going on. So when you just take that character and plop her in the middle of a Friday the 13th movie, it doesn't work. It doesn't have the same effect. You just have a very distant and unpleasant lead character without having anything interesting to explore, say, in the process. Add to that, you have this doctor who's the absolute worst. And so a movie that has its moments, I got some nostalgia for it, but overall doesn't fully work for me. Number 24, Halloween Ends. And at the time I am recording this, the movie has been out for a couple of weeks, and it has been an interesting weeks of debates on the internet because this has just been such a polarizing film where most people, most fans seem to not particularly like it, but there's a batch of people that love this movie, and there's not a lot in the middle. It's just people on two polarizing ends with this film, and I obviously, given its placement, I'm in that camp that thinks that this was not a very good film and not a very good Halloween film. Just going into it, I don't feel like Halloween 2018 or Halloween Kills set up this movie. It doesn't feel to me that they had 3 movies worth of plot to tell. They had maybe 1.5 movies worth of plot, decided to stretch it out to a trilogy, and so then they just had to come up with ideas to kind of fill in the rest. And so it just feels like this very odd film that is primarily about this character of Corey and the effects of Michael Myers' massacres on Haddonfield. And then you get to the third act, and we just kill off Corey before it even begins. And we tack on a final battle between Laurie and Michael, which on a just standalone story level just doesn't really work because the first hour and 20 minutes set up one thing, and then the last 20 minutes delivers something different. As a Halloween movie, if we wanted to make this about Corey and all this other stuff, you need to set him up before this. So it just feels really odd. Michael in this film doesn't feel consistent with what they established in the previous movie where he was indestructible, and now Corey can just push him over and he can get defeated by an old woman. And so it's just like so many things just don't add up to me. And I've read all the arguments. I've been following all of it. I kind of understand why some of you people love this movie. Even my good buddy Griffin made a video essay on how it's misunderstood and how he loves it. I don't see it. I don't see it. I don't think it works as a movie. I don't think it works as a Halloween movie. I think there's some ideas in here that are kind of interesting. And had they just ended it with 2018 or with Kills and killed Michael at the end of Kills and done this movie as like a launch of a new Halloween Haddonfield anthology series, and it was just about Corey and it didn't have the baggage of trying to have a showdown between Michael and Laurie, I probably would have dug it. As it's trying to do too many things, I don't think it does any of them well. Next up, Friday the 13th, Part 8. Jason Takes a Boat to Vancouver. Jason Takes Manhattan. A movie that actually has a pretty fun, schlocky premise about Jason Voorhees ending up in the Big Apple itself and going crazy killing people. And this movie absolutely does not deliver on the promise of the premise at all. The producers got too cheap, and so then they just had to scale back all of these ideas, all the fun stuff that they brainstormed, that you and I could have brainstormed about what to do with Jason Voorhees in Manhattan. They got cheap, decided to shoot it on a boat and in Vancouver, and only just a few days in New York to just do a couple establishing shots. Now, once you get past the fact that they wasted the premise, there are a lot of really fun, goofy, stupid kills in this movie. I mean, he kills someone with a guitar. He punches a dude's head off.
Take your best shot.
And it does feature cocaine.
Cocaine is a hell of a drug.
So, I mean, I'd say the kills are more fun than normal in a goofy way. And there's when you get into the final act of this movie where they're killing off Jason, it's like toxic waste in New York is released at a certain time every day, and that reverts Jason back into a child. The movie just gets so weird and insane that almost, it just adds to the charm of it. It's not good, but it is kind of entertaining. Number 22, Rob Zombie's Halloween. And as I mentioned before with Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, I can very much respect the fact that Rob Zombie has a clear vision for his films. And unlike so many movies lower on this list, it really feels like one person made the film. In the writing, the direction, it's cohesive. And I appreciate that in trying to remake Halloween, while on a basic story level, it's the same story, but it is very much a reimagining when it comes into the particulars of what's going down here, where John Carpenter had this very simple idea of Michael Myers was just evil. There was no attempt to humanize or explain it. He was just this evil shape walking and killing people. And Rob Zombie takes this opposite approach where he's exploring this perfect storm of nature and nurture that created this monster that was Michael Myers, and why did it get so much worse, and how did it escalate? And has a Loomis that, while he certainly has his own flaws, is more hopeful towards Michael than the Donald Pleasance version of the character was. All of that's very interesting. And I think it could have worked. But in the execution, as I mentioned before, Rob Zombie just makes everything so abrasive, so crass, so in your face.
Some things should work, but do they?
Just right out of the gate, you've just got these hillbillies screaming at each other in the most vulgar way imaginable. You don't get Laurie Strode introduced in the film until 45 minutes in. And even as we introduce her in this normal suburban home, the first thing that she does is make like really crass penetration jokes, sex jokes to her adopted mother, using a bagel to visualize the penetration. Like, why? Like, what on earth are we doing here? And then the other one that just made the movie really tough to stomach for me, despite really appreciating a lot of aspects to it, is it just has like an uncomfortably large amount of flippant rape and sexual violence, where so many of the kills involve girls who are literally naked being dragged around. There's the director's cut has the infamous rape escape that's just like this very just vulgar scene, just to create a scenario and a context where Michael could escape. Of all the ways to do it, that's the way it went. And then one that just always is kind of odd to me, of all the actresses to cast who's running around naked, screaming, and covered in blood for 15, 20 minutes of this film, they cast the actress most famous for being the little girl in a couple of the Halloween films. Now, I know Danielle Harris in real life is 5 years older than me. She was 30 years old-ish whenever she made this movie. Like, I get it. But of all people, that's just a weird choice. So a movie that there's so many things about it, I was like, that's pretty cool. I like that. That's an interesting idea. But on just an actual viewing experience, it's so unpleasant. Then we have Halloween 5, and this feels like a movie that subverts expectations exclusively at its own cost. The movie repeatedly takes what everyone thinks is going to happen and delivers something worse and less interesting. The most obvious example is that number 4 ends with the cliffhanger of Jamie now has become the new killer, and they set that up as a direction they could go, and then this movie immediately undoes that to have Michael Myers once again return to kill people Halloween night.
You've made a huge mistake.
Subverted expectations, but it subverted expectations to do what has been done many times before without having much to add to the formula. Likewise, there was a fan favorite in Rachel, a character that was like supportive, got in on the action, wasn't really fully the final girl, but was involved. People like the character. So let's subvert expectations, kill her off at the beginning of the movie in a very just kind of like lazy throwaway death. People don't even notice she's dead, and replace her with Tina, a character that nobody likes, who has no motivation in the film, isn't aware that the movie's taking place. She's just loud, obnoxious. And as soon as she realizes something is going on in the movie, she's killed off. Like, it's just like a totally like bizarre choice to replace a character people like with someone that they don't like that doesn't actually do anything in the movie whatsoever. So just a lot of issues here. At the same time, it does just still provide the Halloween experience. So when I look at a lot of movies lower on this list, maybe some of them have more artistic merit, maybe some of them have better ideas in them, but this one just kind of provides the classic Halloween experience of Michael returning, killing people. That's what I go to these movies for, so I get what I want from a Halloween film out of this one, even if it's lazy and stupid in a bunch of its plot choices, and very importantly, you also get one of Loomis's best lines.
I prayed that he would burn in hell, but in my heart, I knew that hell would not have him.
We're at the top 20 with A Nightmare on Elm Street 2010. And this is a movie that feels like it had all the right ingredients and the right recipe to do something fresh and new with the Freddy Krueger character and mythology, but something just went wrong in the process and it didn't come together in the end. On a positive note, this is a great cast here of some legacy actors, some familiar faces, and some great actors who were very early on in their career. The cast here, definitely not the problem with this film. Likewise, with modern technology, there's a couple times where the CGI doesn't hold up or it's not as good as the practical stuff, but there were also some new things that they could do and ways to transition into dreams that green screen CGI allowed that made for some cool new additions with an updated technology. Movie itself, I think they got themselves into some trouble where I understand they wanted to make a grittier, nastier version, get closer to the original film, but even kind of take it a little bit more horrifying.
This won't hurt one little bit.
And so they decided to go very overt with the child molestation aspect of Freddy Krueger. Now, it was always kind of implied. There's always a sexual nature to what he was up to, but it was much less stated. It was just kind of in the background, so you knew something was up there. And this movie takes that and puts it on the forefront. And part of the fun of this franchise of Freddy Krueger is that he's like a charismatic, fun psycho. And with some innuendo, you can still kind of get away with that. But as soon as you just start overtly presenting him as a rapist, a child rapist, all of that's gone and there's just disgust. And there only should be disgust. Now, it is a horror film, and so it should be horrifying. But it also needs to be enjoyable, and that's not. And that's compounded also by, they added this mystery side to it of like this idea of like, what if he was innocent and the children made up the stories so the parents killed him based off lies and now he's out for revenge against the children who lied about him. That's kind of an interesting idea of maybe a different spin on all of this is what was going on, but they didn't actually follow through on it. And so what the movie ends up doing is making you feel bad for a pedophile rapist for 20 minutes. Not a great plan. Not a great experience for the viewer to be like, you feel bad for the pedophile, and then you're like, oh yeah, I guess I don't feel bad for him. So just that some ideas that they don't go together very well. They don't make for a better experience. They don't serve the film all that well. So I don't think this one is as bad as a lot of people make it out to be. I think it has more merit to it. It does have some interesting ideas, some slickness, some updates because of technological advances. But also in all of that, I think you lose a lot of the charm of the original one with so many of the changes that they make. Number 19, Friday the 13th, 3D. At least it was in 3D when it came out 40 years ago. Now if you watch it, there's just all these goofy shots of people poking stuff up at the camera. Now this is a totally by the numbers Friday the 13th film where Jason Voorhees, I had to pause and think for a second, I was about to say Michael Myers. That's a different franchise. Jason Voorhees returns to Camp Crystal Lake to kill unsuspecting people engaged in the drugs and the sex. It has all the beats that you want. It's got some fun kills. It's got the classic moment where he finally dons the iconic hockey mask that he's so now famous for. You know, but when it comes to the movie itself, it's just more of the same. Now, for me, the Friday the 13th movies were my horror movies when I was growing up. They were the ones that I saw on TNT, TBS the most, that, as I mentioned before, they just kind of came on cable. So I checked these ones out. So they're just easy for me to put on and watch. They're very digestible. They're very consumable, easy to watch. If you're just in the mood for Jason to show up and kill people, that's what you get with these movies. And it's just one of those. For me, it's like just like right in there. There's nothing in this movie that just makes me mad, annoys me. I'm like, oh, what are they doing? There's also nothing in this movie that stands out and makes it memorable besides Jason getting the mask and all the shots of people doing this. Like, other than that, it's just like, yeah, another one of these movies that I enjoy and have fun with, but it doesn't bring anything new to the table. Number 18, Jason X. Now, movies like this are why in my movie reviews I vote a letter and a number grade. Because is this a good movie? Absolutely not. Is this a fun movie? Yeah, this is a really fun movie. Now, I'm totally biased when it comes to this movie. I went to go see this movie with a group of my rowdiest friends, saw it with an audience of rowdy people. We all knew exactly what movie we were about to go watch. Jason Voorhees in space. That's stupid. But it's so stupid, it's fun. And that's what this movie is to me. It knows it's a ridiculous concept, but it goes for it, and it finds all of the fun little things to do, whether using cryo technology to freeze someone's face so you can smash it, throwing little puns in there, doing something so audacious as Uber Jason, or doing the hologram sequence so you could do the callback to the classic 80s movies and recreate one of the classic kills where Jason puts a girl in a sleeping bag and just starts smacking two sleeping bags together. It's audacious, it's ridiculous, it doesn't take itself seriously, it's definitely not scary. But it's schlocky fun, and it's very rewatchable for me. Next up, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. Taken at face value, this is an odd but endearing misfire filled with 80s cheese.
You are all my children now.
Now, it's entirely watchable for me. It's a lot more fun than Dream Master, Dream Child, Freddy's Dead. But it's still a movie that on a plot level is very odd and kind of has some issues. You have a protagonist who's turning into Freddy, and that means that there's no one really to root for because our lead character is the one that's doing the killing. So it just creates a little bit of an odd nature in the way that it works. Likewise, it's a movie that has its own standalone Freddy mythology. Like, it does its own thing. Doesn't follow the rules of the first movie. None of the sequels use the Freddy powers introduced in this film. They basically ignore that this movie and all of this stuff took place. So it's just kind of odd. There's some fun stuff. There's some great 80s practical gore and effects that take place. But where this one gets really interesting is when you understand the backstory behind everything going on with the movie and the conflicting stories as to what exactly went down with the film. Apparently the writer intentionally put some like homoerotic subtext into the film, and then the way the movie worked out, they hired a closeted homosexual to play the lead character. And so when the movie came out, the reception of the movie like wrecked the guy's life. And for decades, the writer wouldn't admit that he did any of these. Like, what? No, that was just that guy. He did all that. Was just his performance. I didn't write any of that in there. And then about 10 years ago, the writer finally said, like, well, yeah, of course it was in there. And there's actually a whole documentary about all this called Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street, where the lead actor of it did a documentary about his experience in the franchise and his clashing with the writer. Really, really interesting stuff. And so actually I saw the documentary at Fantastic Fest before it actually officially released, and the actor was there, and I walked by him while we were entering the room. I was like, oh, you're the star of the movie. Like you're the guy that made this documentary. That's pretty cool. And so it's really interesting when you know the backstory behind all of it. Even like the director's like, oh yeah, I wasn't aware of any of that. I didn't know what was going on with the actor. I didn't know the writer put that stuff in there. Like I was just trying to make a Freddy movie as best as I could. So a movie very flawed, interesting choices were made, but also much more watchable than the movies lower on this list. Number 16, Friday the 13th, Part 2. Jason Voorhees' first adventure, and a movie that right out of the gate made it pretty clear that this franchise was pretty loose with its continuity because Jason was definitely dead in the first movie, and now he's back. Don't know how, don't know what he's been up to all these years, but he's back to avenge his mother and take up her cause of killing those pesky camp counselors at Camp Crystal Lake. Now, in a lot of ways, it is a rehash of the first movie with counselors being killed at the camp who are unaware of what's going on. But it is a movie with a bigger budget. Its runtime is shorter, and it also has a recap at the beginning, so it just moves probably at a better, nice, brisker pace than the first film. And so just, you know, if you're just there to watch Jason kill people, you get that with this film. There's not as much intrigue with this movie as there was in the first film. Of course, I think Jason makes for a more credible killer, and because they're not trying to hide that it's him, it makes the kills more interesting when they take place. So there's a number of ways in which this one improves upon the first film, and a number of ways in which it's not quite as original, not quite as interesting, but an important horror film. And if you're just into like that classic 80s slasher vibe, this is about as classic 80s slasher vibe as you can get. Number 15, Halloween 2. And this is a movie that, I don't know, hasn't aged all that well with me.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
Now, when you watch it back to back with the original Halloween, it is a nice companion piece. Tonally, it matches that film better than the other sequels. And so they mesh together pretty nicely. And by kind of cranking up the gore and kills,
the body count is always bigger. The death scenes are always much more elaborate. More blood, more gore.
I think it adds just a nice energy to it that if you're not going to have quite as strong of a plot and not as much suspense, you crank up the shock, and that's what this movie does. But there's a number of problems here. Biggest one for me is that Laurie Strode is literally in bed medicated and sleeping most of the runtime. So you take your lead character, put them in bed, and just don't give them anything to do until they're running for their life in the last 15 minutes. Not a great strategy. Likewise, I just don't find Michael Myers walking around a hospital nearly as interesting as him stalking high school girls who are doing normal day-to-day life. And then finally, the sibling twist, I never thought was all that great of an idea because it's just not set up in the first film. So it just feels like it kind of came out of nowhere. And if you're watching this movie and you just look down at your phone for a second, you'll miss it. And it doesn't really affect much. It's just like a random piece of information that sequels ran off and made a big deal out of it. But the first two movies themselves, it's just like a random like, oh, he's out to get Laurie. That's why. That's it. That's as deep as it goes. This is an interesting one because it seems like the fans historically have been kinder to this film than the filmmakers themselves, who the producers, creators, almost all of them had some less than favorable things to say about this film.
And I think Halloween 2 is an abomination and a horrible movie. I was really disappointed in it.
You can imagine my dismay when the script came back to me and I read it. I just hated it.
I personally was not too pleased with the script when I got it. It was pedestrian. It was predictable.
Then we have Halloween Kills, and this is a movie it feels like your enjoyment of this film is directly proportional to the mileage you get out of the
carnage candy.
As for me, this is a very frustrating watch because I really do enjoy all of the gnarly kills, the carnage candy, the insanity, but there's just some like bad ideas in here and some sloppy execution. I actually really enjoy the idea of the town forming the lynch mob, going after Michael Myers, and that having dire consequences. I think that's a really good idea. They did it before in Halloween 4, and they did it better in Halloween 4, but it's a good idea if you're going to do a movie like this where Michael is on the rampage and got free. People are going to want to fight back. The way it played out by having them chase down one guy at a hospital who jumps out a window, I don't know about that. But the big thing that just hurts this movie is that they just make the people too stupid. And they're just doing unbelievably dumb things so that Michael can live so he can have a third film. And then they make Michael indestructible. So in the course of this night, he's shot in the chest, I think at least 7 times. He's burned alive. He's hit in the head with a bag of bricks. He's hit in the head with a baseball bat. He's run over by a car. And then at the end of the movie, he still gets up and beats the crap out of a lynch mob. there's just no rules. There's nothing governing what he can and can't do. So none of it matters. There's no set of rules you can follow to defeat him. It's just he wins if that's what they want to have happen, and he stops winning when they want him to stop winning. So it's just really frustrating because when you're just seeing Michael go nuts and kill people, that's what I come to these movies to watch. But I want it to at least make some sense. Number 13, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. One of the strangest sequels of all time from any franchise, because they decided to ditch their main plot line, their characters, and do something totally different, but release it in under the same banner, Halloween. So a bunch of people showed up expecting Michael Myers, and, well, they were disappointed.
I'm very disappointed.
But if you can step back from the fact that this is a bizarre film to put in this particular franchise, take it on its own merits, it is kind of this weird, bizarre 80s Invasion of the Body Snatchers-esque paranoia thriller horror film, which quite literally, a week or two back, I described the plot of this movie to my wife, and she thought I was joking. She just thought I was making stuff up like, yeah, I mean, but seriously, what's the plot of Halloween 3? It's like, no, literally, it is about evil masks that you put them on kids, and it kills the kids, and it's powered by microchips ground down from Stonehenge because there's a guy that wants to, like, continue Samhain or something like that. And she's like, what? It's so weird. It's so wacky. It plays it so straight that it's like fun. Like it's just a really cool deal. And it's not poorly made. Like other movies on this list are like, have some certain incompetence. They're a rehash. This is something fresh, new, original, bizarre. Not putting it in this franchise, not a great idea. Does it work on its own terms? Yeah, it does. Misstep in the franchise? Yeah.
I take no responsibility for Halloween 3. The decision not to use the Michael Myers character was stupid.
Next up, Friday the 13th. And this is an interesting one because it's a horror classic that's also infamous for being commissioned for the purpose of ripping off Halloween. They were instructed to write a movie that just copied the Halloween formula, but was different enough that they wouldn't get sued. And that's where Friday the 13th came from. It's also a bizarre film because the Friday the 13th movies are famous for Jason Voorhees as this hockey mask wearing killer. And in this movie, he's dead. And his mother's the killer. In fact, it's a little bit of a whodunit. It's all about the intrigue of who is the killer. And so you're watching a series of kills without knowing who's behind all of them, leading to our Scooby-Doo ending of sorts, where it's discovered it's an old mother who's quite angry about how her child was treated 20 years earlier. So it's an odd movie inside of the franchise. Its legacy is quite interesting because it was commissioned for totally non-artistic reasons. And then it became a classic of the genre. And some of that just came about because it tried to do a bunch of like these gore effects at a time where that wasn't as common. And they brought in a guy that became this practical gore effects legend of the 70s and 80s, Tom Savini. And he's almost the star of the movie with all the stuff that he did that people just hadn't really seen before. So this low budget knockoff film ends up being a big, gigantic hit on its own terms and launching this gigantic franchise that has lasted for decades. And we're talking about it now over 40 years later. So, you know, on its own terms, detached from its historic context, it feels quite quaint compared to modern horror films. And, you know, the simplicity of the characters, and most of them are totally, they're unaware that anything's going on until they get killed, until you get to the third act and we have our fight going on. So it plays out a little bit odd, but a movie that's, was so important to launching all these slasher films of the 80s, and a movie that in a lot of ways is important to all of us that are watching this video, because the fact that we got into slasher films and horror films goes back to the popularity that started with this movie and Halloween. So a movie that's just an interesting piece of horror history. Number 11, Friday the 13th for the final chapter. And in a lot of ways, this is just another one of these movies. Jason returns, kills a bunch of people that are doing drugs and each other. They have to duke it out in the end. He gets defeated. It's the same as the previous two films, but it's a better version of them on almost every single level. The characters are much more memorable, in particular, and of course, Tommy Jarvis became major character in the next few films. And he's played by a young Corey Feldman, so he pops and he stands out. But even when you throw, like, Crispin Glover in there, might not be the most interesting of characters, but he brings so much Crispin Glover weirdness that all of a sudden, generic character is someone that you kind of remember because he's in there. Another important detail for this movie for me is that they have a character that's actually trying to hunt down Jason in the movie, which I think fixes a lot of what's wrong with the first few movies of people just being kind of clueless. You have a little bit more of an involved plot of people being aware of what's going on in the middle of it. Joe Zito's not like a world-class director, but I think he's a better director than what we had before this. Just has a little bit more production flair. Tom Savini returned under the promise that the final chapter was actually going to end here. So you get more of kind of his great gore effects. So, yeah, like I said, it's not like an amazing slasher film to me, but it's a better version of what they had done in the previous three films, and it leads to a definitive ending. Until Jason came back. Kicking off our top 10 is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. And after years away from the franchise, Wes Craven returned, kind of turned the franchise on its head and did something wildly different with the entire thing. And in a lot of ways, created what was sort of a prototype for Scream. Now, tonally, story-wise, they're very different, but both of them have kind of this meta understanding of horror. And have this perspective where the characters know that they're in a horror movie.
This is still a script we're talking about, right, Wes?
You decided to cross over out of films into our reality.
Likewise, both of them involve characters receiving phone calls that are threatening all throughout them. And so just a number of parallels between this movie and Scream. I enjoy Scream quite a bit more as a film, but it's just interesting to see Wes Craven finding his way between what he'd done before, making it to the Scream franchise, which was such a big part of the later section of his career. The whole movie is just filled with kind of interesting ideas, and you can tell there's a certain creative spark going on. I mean, just at its core, the idea of bringing back Heather Langenkamp to play herself, not play Nancy, but in a movie that is a continuation of the Nightmare on Elm Street series, but not actually being in continuity, but tying into the continuity of those films in another way. It's just really interesting. Just something so different that it's outside the box, doesn't all work. It's not a movie that I like re-explore and just watch a lot, but it's one that whenever I do put it on, which I literally watched it earlier today, I always enjoy the experience and get so much out of it. It's just such a fascinating project and a cool movie to exist.
And I think, without a doubt, it's my favorite of the films now. I think it's so smart. Every time I see it, I find something new.
Number 9, Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. Now, I was a little bit late to checking out this run of Halloween films. I watched them for the very first time just a few years back whenever I first ranked the Halloween movies. And so it took a little while for the whole Thorn trilogy to kind of grow on me at all, or even the idea of Jamie as the lead character. But this movie has aged really well with me. Every time I rewatch it, I'm like, I really dig that one, and I like it more and more. Now, you have to be able to accept a few things to just go along with this movie, that Michael and Loomis survived, that Laurie Strode was killed off screen, and that the entire franchise revolves around the Laurie and Michael plot twist, which I'm not crazy about, but I think it works well enough in this movie. But once you get past that, I think this is just a really good addition to the franchise, where the basic premise, Michael Myers returns, in a certain ways is a repeat of what we did in the first movie, but the town itself has changed. And so he comes into a town that's aware of his existence and is afraid of him. And so I just love that idea of when Loomis shows up and he goes to the sheriff actually takes him seriously. And the town goes into a panic and form these lynch mobs that kill the wrong person. And while the lynch mobs do terrible things, they're also pivotal in the rescue in the third act. I just love all of that. Now, it's not nearly as much about the suspense and the tension. It's much more action-based. As a guy that loves action, I don't mind that at all. So for me, this is just a great Halloween sequel, and all of it leads up to actually shocking final plot twist. Then we have Freddy vs. Jason, and full disclosure on this one, I have a ton of nostalgia for this film. I went to go see it opening night with a packed crowd, and that's the perfect way to experience this movie. At its core, it's an inherently schlocky idea for a film. Taking two horror icons, just have them go at it, duking it out. It's a ridiculous premise, but a very fun one at the same time. Likewise, the inherent nature of a movie like this allows a character like Freddy, who's a psycho, but that's kind of fun and charismatic, just lets Robert Englund just go nuts and have fun and feel like it actually fits the movie that he's in. The central premise here about Freddy using Jason to spark more fear in the community, to gain more strength, I don't know, I think the idea works well enough, sets up the scenario that would put them in the same location and have a little rivalry between the two of them. And I think they did a good enough job finding a way to kind of like merge the two franchises that are wildly different franchises at their core. It absolutely feels like a Nightmare on Elm Street film with Jason crashing the party, but they also give Jason plenty of time to tear people up with his machete, as well as finding ways to end up at Crystal Lake and have some of the iconic imagery that you want. That's 21st century, like gloss, shine, polish. So it works really nicely while not being overly CGI or anything like that. Now, this isn't great cinema, and it's not like a scary movie at all. It plays more like a cartoon in a lot of ways because it is so wacky and crazy. And there's certainly shots in it that were too Looney Tunes cartoons for me. Other parts to it, a little bit too WWE professional wrestling in the way they tackled things. But if you're going to do a movie like this, I think they did about as good of a job as you can do. It's a movie with no pretenses. Like it is just trying to take a pretty silly concept that they knew fans would like and mash the two franchises together. And I think they did about as good of a job as you can do with that. Number 7, Halloween H2O. A nice kick in the pants for the franchise after a fairly drab Thorn trilogy that just bogged everything down with way too much mythology. At its core, it's all about one very simple premise. 20 years later, having a rematch between Michael Myers and Laurie Strode and just trying to deliver nice, fun payoff with that concept, and I think it does a good job of it. Now, I know a lot of people take issue with this film because it is very Scream inspired. Kevin Williamson was a part of developing the story and the script for it, and so for some people, it's just too much of a Screamified Halloween film. For me, Scream's my favorite horror movie of all time. The Kevin Williamson era of slasher films was my formative years. They came out while I was in high school, so I don't mind at all that we have a Screamified Halloween movie. For me, it's a merger of franchise that I like with another franchise that I like, so it works well enough for me. At its core, you also have a great set of actors. Of course, Jamie Lee Curtis returning, but then you have like Josh Hartnett in his very first film and a bunch of other faces that have had big careers over the last 25 years. And you just have a story that it knows exactly what it's trying to do. Set up a final showdown between our two lead characters, and it kind of trims everything else away, just gives us the setup for where she's at in life, how she's been running, hiding, damaged by him, so that when they duke it out in the end, it's so satisfying. She chooses not to run, but to turn around and fight him, and you get this, cathartic payoff. That's what I wanted. It was so good. It was so satisfying. Until we get to the next movie and they undid all of it.
You blew it! You blew it!
Number 6, Friday the 13th, Part 6, Jason Lives. And of the original run of Jason films, I feel like this one is safely the best of the bunch because it's the one that kind of got the right tone. The earlier Friday the 13th films I felt were just like too self-serious and didn't understand the inherent silliness of what was going on. And some of the later ones got way too silly, too outrageous. And this one is kind of that sweet spot right in the middle where it plays it fairly straight. I mean, you get a couple wacky things in there like the James Bond parody intro, but it plays it fairly straight while also knowing there's an inherent silliness of all of this, and it plays into that a good bit. The other thing that I think elevates this movie is that without overcomplicating things, it has a much more defined plot than the 5 movies that came beforehand. And what I mean by that is that from the beginning of the film, Tommy Jarvis knows that Jason is alive and he's trying to stop them. He knows that Jason is heading to Camp Crystal Lake, so you have a lead character with an objective and a villain headed to a place, so there's a ticking clock that provides urgency to everything going on. In most of the earlier films, for the first 2 acts, no one knows that there is a killer, so they're just doing stuff. They're drinking, they're skinny dipping, they're screwing, but none of it has anything to do with the plot. They're just waiting to die. They have no plot objective. They have no motivation. They have no purpose. They're just there to do stuff until they die. But in this movie, you have a character that's actually trying to stop our villain, and it just kind of elevates everything. It's not complex. It's not like, wow, what a world-class plot. Man, you took that to crazy different levels. No. It just adds just enough to it to where you can get invested in the journey that's going on, have setup, payoff, and so it's satisfying when things happen. When Tommy succeeds, when Tommy fails, you actually care because you know why it's happening. So for all those reasons, I think it got the tone right. It had just enough more plot, just enough more character work to make for a much more satisfying experience. We're starting the top 5 with A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. And this feels like a sequel that they actually put thought into of how do you feel true to what was in the original film while expanding the mythology, diving into Freddy's backstory a little bit, but without rehashing the first movie. And of this original batch of sequels, this is the only one that I feel actually did all of those things. Most of them just felt like a rehash with a bunch of weird stuff thrown in. And this one really built out the world and did something new. There's a couple of things behind the scenes that just kind of really aided this film. Right off the bat, you have Wes Craven returning to do some of the early story work. And then Frank Darabont, who has directed some like best movies of all time category. He was the guy that kicked off The Walking Dead. He wrote like the shooting script. And so there's just a lot of talent that went into developing the script. They ended up getting a really great cast for the film. And just as it played out, in the execution, you get some very memorable kills. The puppet one, as well as the primetime one, of course, being a couple of the standouts there, and just having an interesting idea of like, how do you take this dream idea and flip it the other way? And so you end up getting a little bit like, the X-Men in the dream world and people teaming up as kind of superheroes to battle Freddy. It just felt like something interesting, new, different. There's still stakes. There's still consequences. You have characters sacrificing themselves. It's got a little bit of everything going on in there. Times a little bit cheesy, a little bit of a product of its times. It's not flawless, but there's a lot of really cool stuff going on here. Kicks off with a great opening idea about Freddy using dreams to trick the kids into hurting themselves and getting them institutionalized. Just a really solid film that expands on what was so great in the original. In 4th place, Friday the 13th, 2009. For me, the remake is the best of the Friday the 13th films. It delivers everything that I like from this series, and it doesn't take itself too seriously, but it doesn't treat the franchise like a joke either. It balances those two things nicely. Likewise, it pulls not just from the original film, because Jason wasn't the killer in the original film. It pulls a whole bunch of plot points from all of the pre-zombie Jason films, mixes them together, and then adds in its own plot points about this girl that goes missing and a brother trying to track her down. And when you put that all together, you just get kind of the best of all of it. You know, the early Friday the 13th films, as previously discussed in this video, don't have a ton of plot. And in a lot of them, the characters don't really know what's going on. They don't have a clear objective that ties into the plot. And this movie pulls all the plot points, the mask and Jason and his mother, it pulls those plot points and puts them in here. But then it gives us this Clay character who's trying to find his sister. So he's involved with everything going on that sends them to a place, and they're looking at Crystal Lake and investigating. So there's a clear objective. There's someone to care about. There's something that we want to see accomplished where there's stakes and consequences all along the way. But you also have your college-age students out partying, drinking, wanting to do drugs on each other, getting killed all along the way. So you get the best of all of it. Also, you get a really vicious Jason that feels like a threat, that's dangerous, that if he's in front of you, he's going to come and get you, and you better get out of there very, very quickly. I mean, it's just like a very brutal, harsh version of the character, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. Now, I know some purists have taken issue with some plot points in here and some changes that they made and the way that they did things. I feel like this franchise has never taken its continuity seriously. From the very second movie, they retconned the fact that Jason was dead. And then you get to number 6 and suddenly he's a zombie. Then you get to Jason Goes to Hell and suddenly he's a deadite brought back to life by the Necronomicon. Then he's in space in the next one. So, you know, if they decide to redo some stuff and change it to make their own continuity, I'm totally fine with that. When it comes to this franchise, I feel like this movie pulls in all the stuff that I like and tells a clear little narrative inside of it that gives me characters to care about with a nice, vicious aesthetic to all of it. Real quick before I give you my top 3, remember I'm not the only one ranking all 33 movies from these 3 franchises. We also got CP's, Cody Leach's, and Brian Lomax's videos. You can check them out somewhere around here once this video is over with. Likewise, I've done a ton of other horror content, and we've done a ton of these other 31 on 31s before, so there's a ton of cards right up here that'll take you to their videos. It'll take you to my playlist talking about horror movies. If you love to talk horror too much, there's a lot to check out afterwards right up there, somewhere up there. In third place, Halloween 2018. And for me, this is a movie that I just felt delivered a great aesthetic with a truly vicious Michael Myers. And they found a way to not copy the stalker vibe of the original film, but have its own kind of version of that where you just feel the tension in each individual sequence, where Michael walks into a bathroom and it just slowly ratchets up the tension until he's dropping teeth and viciously killing people. And then it parallels that with showing what Laurie Strode's life looks like, that she's been a very troubled person ever since 1978. And she's been preparing for the day that he would return. She's barely a functioning person, but she has a purpose and something she's been training for. Thus, it builds this expectation of a great final showdown, and that's what the movie builds towards. So when you get into the last 20 minutes, it's believable that this 60-year-old woman is going to battle with this vicious killer because it's all she's been preparing for and has designed her house for this purpose. So it has tension, but also has action. And they found ways to even have twists and turns with what they were doing and took elements of the ways that Laurie was a bad mother that also made her perfect for preparing for this particular evening. And it's a movie that in a lot of ways, I might have even liked it more than the original, but there's just a couple of things that had just sabotaged the film.
We were on the verge of greatness. We were this close.
There's some misplaced humor, and then the new Loomis character started off as a cheap knockoff of Loomis, and then just turned into a bad plot point when you got into the back half of the film. But overall, just a great Halloween sequel. Our runner-up, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Just a fantastic premise for a horror film on multiple different fronts. Right off the bat, there's just something really interesting, compelling about a killer who kills you in your dreams. Therefore, you're trying to stay awake. But as a human being, you have to sleep. And so it just adds in this whole tension and conflict in an interesting way that's fresh and new inside of a genre that by 1984 was even starting to get oversaturated and had a whole new spin on it. Likewise, as soon as you set the kills in Dream World, there's so many creative, interesting, and weird things that you can do with that concept. But adding on top of all of that, Wes Craven was able to come up with this fantastic character in Freddy Krueger, who has a very creepy backstory, but also has a fun personality because of Robert Englund's performance. And so he's able to be terrifying while also having a certain charisma to him. And he's fun to see on screen, where Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, they're personalityless shapes that kill people. Freddy's the opposite. He's a person with a personality that toys with people and messes with them and cracks jokes. Just adds all this extra fun to the experience of watching people being brutally murdered. Speaking of people being brutally murdered, there's a number of just creative, interesting kills here. And it's from an era before CGI, before green screen. And so you get the fun of actual movie magic when you have Tina like rolling around on the ceiling. It's creepy and disturbing in an interesting way because there was a real person in this building that was spinning and she's rolling around on it using all sorts of film trickery. And so it just looks very cool while also being terrifying at the same time. And just all along the way, there's little details that just make for a great, great horror film. It might get a little bit too Home Alone in the third act, that I don't know it's aged all that well in that particular aspect to it. There's a couple ways that I think it breaks its own rules, but overall, you get a great final girl, a great killer, and a fantastic premise for a horror film and franchise. But in first place, John Carpenter's Halloween, a classic of the genre that launched a bazillion imitators, and while its basic premise is familiar and has been knocked off a bazillion times, what makes it special is John Carpenter's gift of delivering excellence through simplicity, of finding a way to just build tension and having this unsettling tone from beginning to end. I mean, the movie kicks off with what is essentially its own short film. This long single take walking into a house where you watch a character, not knowing who it is, go in, murder someone, only to have it revealed that it was a small child that did all of this. Just an unsettling, disturbing idea. It works as a short film in and of itself, and it sets the tone for everything to come. Where as you go into the movie, it takes a little while before the kills start to kick in, but you still have the tension and danger because we know what this person did as a child. And then it does this brilliant thing of having Loomis running throughout the entire film, desperate to catch him before he can do anything because he knows how dangerous this person is and is hyping up everything that Jason could Michael Myers. I knew I probably have done it many other times in here before, talking about Jason and Michael in the same video too much. You're destined to make some oopsies in there, but he knows exactly what Michael Myers could and will do. And so even though Michael's not killing all that many people in the middle section of the film, you always feel that danger. You know something awful is going to happen. And just there's a brilliance to all of it. It's such a straightforward plot line. There's not a ton of twists and turns along the way. It's just done with excellence, with the right characters, the right amount of tension, and finding a way to take a character who in the script is described as the Shape and make him interesting and complex because of Loomis and everything that he's doing, everything that he says, and that even though Loomis is just delivering exposition most of the time, he's interesting and charismatic because of this performance and the way that his dialogue is written. So for me, it's just the classic slasher film.
I gotta tell you, it was perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
It doesn't need a lot of bells and whistles. It doesn't need all the flash, because it's all about building the tension, the suspense, and then paying off in that third act. So for me, it comes in at number 1. If you enjoyed this video, remember to check out the rankings from the other members of the Autopstream, Cody Leach, Brian Lomax, CP. Links for their videos are down below in the description as well as in the pinned comment. Also, I've done several of these 31 on 31 videos before. We talked about creature features, exorcism movies, we've done action movies, we've done the MCU and the DCEU, we've done fantasy films. You can check those out in that playlist over there. And if you like horror movies, I've done a ton of horror rankings right over there. Key thing, if you like to talk horror too much, we got plenty of stuff all around here for you to watch. Thank you so much for tuning in for this very long video, and keep talking movies and TV.